Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our healthcare webinar today, Prospects for COVID-19 Medicines, which will be presented by Ivor O'Shea. I suppose this is the Healthcare Committee's first webinar, so I suppose please bear with us in case there's any technical glitches. I suppose firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. We seem to have a good attendance list today. We will be recording the webinar today, and we hope to post it to ActiveView after the event. Throughout the webinar, we would ask you to hold back on questions until Ivor has finished his presentation. However, there is a Q&A functionality, so if you do have any questions that you want to raise during the presentation, feel free to type them in and I can pass them on to Ivor afterwards. There is also a raise hand functionality, so at the end, if you do raise your hand, we can open up the mic and video to you to allow you to interact with Ivor following the event. So I suppose the other thing is, as you have registered, you will be automatically verified for CPD. So there's no need for a follow-up after that. So I suppose on that note, I'll just pass you over to Ivor.
Okay, thank you there, Brendan. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well. As you can see from the title here, I'm going to be talking purely on the topic of medicines for COVID-19. I appreciate COVID-19 is a very broad and serious issue, but I'm going to be laser-like focused on the area of sort of medicines. So if I just bring you down to an agenda that I'd like to go through today. So firstly, I'm going to be going into quite some technical concepts. So I'd like to bring you through a short biotech primer that will give you more background knowledge. Then I'm going to spend a fair bit of time discussing sort of vaccines, which I think are the most promising area here. Then we will spend less time talking about the areas of antivirals, antibodies, repurposed drugs, and then we are going to put all that together into some draft future scenarios that I've put together, and then there will be a conclusion section. And that will take about an hour, I would guess, and about 5 minutes for me to sort of go through. Importantly, I'm going to assume that everyone has a working knowledge of COVID-19 itself and its actual sort of recent sort of history, and I'm purely looking towards the actual future as regards these sort of medicines. So anyway, so we're going to go straight now into the biotech primer. So first thing I'd like to talk to you is about how they actually develop a novel drug and the various steps that they employ for that. And I'm going to use the example of sort of vaccines. And there are various stages. So on this slide, you'll see that the first two stages. First is what they refer to as preclinical. Here you develop and refine a prototype. So this would be a prototype vaccine. I can assure you this is very much an art and not a science. There is a lot of refinement, dead ends, and having to go back to sort of step one. When you do come up with a prototype, you then test out the vaccine or the trial vaccine on blood samples and tissue samples that contain the actual virus. That gives you some hints about whether the vaccine might be toxic to those blood or tissue samples, and that, i.e., you're going to have a sort of safety risk. Also, you can see if the vaccine might actually be affecting the actual virus on those samples. Once you've done that and everything looks reasonable, you then move up to what you might call the proverbial guinea pig stage. You do have to test on sort of animals. You certainly can't move into testing humans before you have reasonable sort of confidence. Again, when you test on animals, you do get a much deeper look at sort of safety. And importantly, you can start to measure whether the animal's own immune system are actually responding to the sort of vaccine, because most animals' immune systems are in fact very, very similar. Now, a lot of the vaccines in development have actually gone past that stage, and to my mind, it is a very, very positive sign that very few are saying that they've actually had any sort of issues there. Now we come on to what we would call phase one. This would typically be about of the order of 25 to 75 fit and healthy adults. And again, that language there is actually quite sort of useful. I would describe this stage almost like climbing up an actual ladder. What you do is you take your lowest dose of the vaccine that you're interested in, you inject your test patients with it, you then wait about 1 month, you see if there's any sort of safety issues. If you get the all clear, then you move up to the next rung, the next higher dose, repeat that same process, and then you go up the various steps until you reach your sort of biggest and sort of largest sort of dose. So it is done in a sequential manner, and safety is very much the actual watchword. While safety is the goal here, you're also looking at hints of effectiveness. In particular, at the higher doses, you're very much looking to see, is the immune system forming sort of antibodies? And antibodies are, of course, are the end goal here. This is what marks out the virus for destruction by various elements of the immune system. And I'm glad to say that quite a few of the vaccines are now through that stage and are just about moving on to phase 2. And I find it very, very important that they seem to be quite confident and that they are in fact not even using their highest dose for sort of phase 2. That suggests to me that they are seeing responses in terms of antibodies. And therefore, even though it's very early days, I would have a strong sense of confidence that we are going to be able to develop vaccines for COVID-19. So moving on to the next slide. So here we have the next stages. So phase 2, which is a much larger phase. You can see that the number of lives certainly jumps up a lot. And here, because we have some confidence in sort of safety, here we might be testing the top 2 or 3 sort of highest doses of the vaccine, plus importantly, a placebo arm. But here we're not doing it in sequence. We're going to do it in sort of parallel and in a side-by-side manner. The goals here are very much, again, safety, because with much more lives, you may come across people with various medical conditions, so on and so forth. Also, because we're focused on the higher levels of doses, we're going to be looking at antibody levels as well in sort of patients. Very importantly, in this stage, it is the company itself who's developing the drug that controls the trial design, the conduct of the trial, and the analysis of the actual results. And I want you to keep that point in mind. Having done phase 2, we come on to sort of phase 3, and here the numbers become huge in terms of vaccines. I would expect the average phase 3 trial for vaccines to encompass 40,000 plus lives. Importantly, you do 2 trials in parallel. That is done because you might have concerns that the actual conduct of the trial itself might be distorting the actual outcome. If you run 2 side by side and they give similar results, then you know nothing like that has actually caused problems. The goals here is you are looking to see how effective the actual vaccine is under real world conditions and being used on lots and sort of people. Also, you're going to get a very detailed look at sort of safety. Now, a very important switch here for these trials, phase 3, is the regulator controls the trial design, the conduct and the analysis. As a biotech investor myself, I would say as a very fair rule of thumb is the apparent effectiveness you might see in a phase 2 trial for any drug. When you do phase 3, about on average, 1/3 of that effectiveness might sort of disappear. And that is very much down to the regulator running those trials much more strictly. And there's lots of games that can be played in phase 2 to make results look that little bit sort of better that you can't use in sort of phase 3. And I'll come on to that point sort of later on in terms of some of the trials that have been done for repurposing existing sort of drugs. Last but not least, you then have to get the regulators to approve your sort of drug. And the key regulators here are the FDA in the US and in Europe, the EMA. So just to have a bit more of a quick look at what a phase 3 trial might actually look like. So here we're looking at Zostavax. Zostavax is a vaccine that's used for shingles. I think it's quite relevant to our current situation. So shingles, you have a 1 in 3 lifetime chance of getting sort of shingles. It can be quite painful, and for 1/10 of those people who get it, they will have severe pain for an extended period of time. It's certainly something you do not want to get. Importantly, as you get older, the chances of getting shingles increase at an exponential level, which is not unlike some of the problems we're seeing with sort of COVID-19. So a lot of the trials for Zostavax have actually looked closely at older sort of age groups, and I'm going to come back to that point sort of later on. So here we can look at this table from left to right. We'll see this sort of trial arms. You have the actual vaccine, and then below it, you have the actual placebo. You see the numbers of lives included, over 10,000 in each. Then you then look at the amount of people after getting the vaccination, how many actually got shingles afterwards. And there you see the actual numbers. You can see it's quite low versus the amount of people who actually got the actual vaccine, but clearly the vaccine arm is doing better than the sort of placebo arm. And then to the right, you have a mathematical incident rate. Now from that, we can say that this vaccine was 70% effective. The maths there is fairly straightforward. And also in this real world example, those lives actually had to be tracked for 1.3 years to accrue the numbers of shingles cases, so you could go through and work through the actual sort of maths. On top of that, there's also a fair amount of time spent actually enrolling these 20,000 plus sort of patients. I think there's a couple of very important aspects of phase 3 trials or vaccines come out from this real world example. Firstly, no vaccine is actually 100% effective. That's a very important point. There's not one single vaccine on this planet that is 100.0% effective. Secondly, you do need thousands of lives to actually work out how effective an actual vaccine is, because it's all about how many of those people are going to be infected. Thirdly, as has been said already, you do need a fair amount of time to actually accrue infections, so you have a viable sort of sample. But an underlying point here is all of this is that, ironically, it is helpful if the pathogen or disease or virus is actively circulating through the actual population as you're running your trial. Ironically, the higher the level of circulation, the quicker you can actually run the actual trial, and the more statistically viable will be the actual outcome. Okay, I'm going to move on then to the next slide. And this is just something just to get your head around what is the probability of getting through the various stages of all this sort of testing. So if we look at this, is particularly data derived for infectious diseases, so mainly vaccines and antibiotics, based on hundreds, if not thousands, of real world trials carried out over the last 10 to sort of 15 years. I got it from this book here, if you can see. It's the closest thing you're going to get to a set of actuarial tables. If you're a biotech investor, I found it to be very, very useful. So it's saying here from left to right, the various stages that I've discussed. Secondly, is the probability, if you're at the start of this stage, what is your chance of actually launching your actual vaccine or drug? And you can see from phase 1, it's actually sort of quite low. And then you sort of build upwards. Now, 2 adjustments that I think are valid to make. In phase 1 and phase 2, about a quarter of all trials are actually stopped, not for scientific reasons, i.e. they think the drug or vaccine doesn't work properly. It's more the company wanted to restructure or didn't actually have the money. In the case of COVID-19, where we're desperate to get something done, I don't think that's going to be the case. I'm happy to take that out. Also, it's fair to say that regulators are going to be very, very benign here. Therefore, I think the chances of sort of approval need to be adjusted downwards. And that gives you that second column. But you can still see, certainly at phase 1, phase 2, the answers are fairly sort of low. And I think what I'm trying to say to you here is, clearly we're going to get medicines and vaccines that are actually going to help, but we're going to have some days where there's going to be bad news, and probably bad news that people will not actually be expecting to get. And then the third row is the average stage duration. So i.e. from the first day, for instance, that you start phase 1 up until the day that you begin to start phase 2 takes an average of 1.5 years. Now, clearly those timelines here are not very helpful in the current situation. And there's lots of talk about skipping trials and so on and so forth. I'll come back to that. I would say there were very obvious ways to actually speed it up without having to sort of skip trials. A lot of this trial work is done in sort of sequence for risk and sort of money purposes. Given where we are, a lot of this work is now being done in sort of parallel. That is very, very helpful. A lot of time is also wasted waiting for people to enroll in your actual sort of trials. Given the huge public interest in COVID-19, enrollment in trials has been ultra sort of quick. That's been very, very helpful. Also, I think we'll discuss it later, but I think regulators are going to be happy enough to only run 1 phase 3 trial, not 2 in sort of parallel. That also helps out. Last point here is approval does have a high bar on safety when it comes to the sort of regulators. They will not let something through that they have doubts in safety, and that is obviously sort of correct. Interestingly, they have a fairly low bar on sort of efficacy. So their kind of concept is, if it's safe and it does some good, well, fine, good. We'll sort of let you sort of launch it. However, this low bar on efficacy sometimes means the efficacy can be very, very marginal. And in practice, 1/3 of all drug launches are clear-cut commercial failures. So again, we may get some examples here of various drugs or vaccines that are approved and all looks very, very promising. But when you look at the fine print, we might find these medicines are not actually adding that much. So again, just to have these at the back of your mind. So now moving on to the prospects for sort of vaccines. So as a high level comment, there are 70+ vaccines in sort of development. I actually have an appendix to this presentation, which I now believe is up on the website in terms of a PDF file that you can look at. And I've gone through 5 vaccines in development in sort of detail. I won't be going through those in terms of my main presentation here. And as I've noted earlier, various reports that I've read are gleaned from preclinical and phase 1 trials suggest that multiple vaccines actually have sort of promise. And importantly, I think there's some media commentary on this, but COVID-19 is not intrinsically a difficult virus to produce a sort of vaccine for. It's from the corona class virus, class of sort of viruses, and vaccines have already been produced there for sort of animals who do suffer from corona sort of viruses. And COVID-19 is not a particularly complicated virus when you analyze it from a virology point of view. There are sadly viruses like HIV, hepatitis C, and HSV, which I've mentioned there. Those are diabolically clever viruses, and they have so far meant that we have not been able to find vaccines for those particular viruses. COVID-19 is not that smart. It is just another sort of virus. So I have no doubt that we're going to get multiple vaccines for this particular virus. However, and of course you probably would have guessed there's a however coming up, I do have serious concerns about various practical points to do with scaling up the manufacturing, issues with the elderly and sort of children, and the practical difficulties in achieving herd immunity. And I'll deal with that at various points in my presentation. So in terms of actually describing vaccines, people are using the word vaccine, not quite realizing there are different types of vaccines, and they have very important features. So I'm going to discuss 2 types. The first one is known as a subunit vaccine, and I think the title, it does give a hint as to what's going on. So traditionally, when you had a vaccine, it was actually a modified form of the virus or the infection itself that was weakened, presented to the immune system through injection. The immune system then develops antibodies and then uses that to fight off the actual sort of real thing later. Here, it's a bit more subtle. You actually find or take out and extract a fragment of the virus. That becomes the vaccine. That's injected into the immune system. The immune system sees this distinctive fragment, forms antibodies against it, and then that's what those antibodies will then sort of lock onto. To date, the fragments have been made through complicated sort of manufacturing techniques. And it's fair to say over the last 10 to 15 years, this has become the dominant form of how to make an actual sort of vaccine. The advantages are, firstly, you can use adjuvants with them. Now, an adjuvant is just any sort of chemical that has the effect of turning up, if you like, the volume of the immune system so that it's much more watching out for foreign bodies. And in that state, it will produce more antibodies. So that allows you to make your vaccine to be more effective. And also importantly, given some of our challenges, you can have a lower dose of the vaccine and get a higher sort of response. It is safer than traditional vaccines because it's only a component of the virus. In of itself, it's 100% harmless, unlike a modified form of a sort of virus. That's pretty critical given the time constraints you're under here where, and frankly, some of the normal safety work is being skipped. And also it works if the immune system is actually compromised, which for a lot of elderly and frail people is often the actual situation. So that is very, very useful here. The cons, it is quite time consuming to actually design these sort of fragments. It typically takes 6 months to an actual year, although they are working here more sort of quickly. Also, I've actually alluded to the complicated manufacturing. At the moment, they are transitioning to new types of manufacturing that will have much higher yields and much more quicker to sort of scale up, but that hasn't really been sort of bedded down yet. So moving on then to RNA and DNA vaccines. So this is in a way a much cleverer type of vaccine. Here, what you're actually doing is almost a bit perverse, but actually it actually does sort of work. Here you do find, instead of using a subunit or a fragment of the virus, you find the relevant DNA or RNA, which is a cousin of sort of DNA, for that fragment. And then almost like a piece of software, you take that DNA, RNA, and you put it into a vector. A vector in practice, ironically, is often an altered but critically harmless virus. And then that becomes the actual vaccine that's injected in. This harmless virus then does what all harmless viruses does. It looks to find human cells, enters those cells, then unloads its DNA stroke RNA, and it uses then that DNA RNA reproduces itself thousands of times inside the body and produces the actual desired subunit, which is shown to the immune system. The pros, I think it's a very clever point, is the human body actually becomes the actual factory. A very small amount of vaccine is used. The virus that is part of the actual vaccine infects cells and produces the actual large amounts of subunits. The design process is also quite quick because you're using parts of sort of DNA. You put it into an actual established sort of virus. That work is very, very quick. Cons, unfortunately, it's a very, very new really. So none have been approved by sort of regulators. None have actually passed a full phase 3 trial. None have been produced at commercial scale. Also, you can't use it with sort of adjuvants. So there are question marks as to how effective these type of vaccines might be. So unfortunately, RNA, DNA vaccines and subunit, their pros and cons are almost mirror images of each other, but they are going to be the two main types that will be used here. So moving on quickly. Then I'm moving on to one of the problems. So certainly, I alluded to earlier about the elderly. Now I've used the example here of 𝗬𝗲𝗲, which again is typically aimed at older people, and there's been very good data collected on how effective this actual vaccine actually is. So we can see here in the first column age bands, and here the second column you can see how effective 𝗬𝗲𝗲 was found in sort of trials. You might recall the 70% figure that we discussed earlier. Problem is, you can see straight away here, as you get older, the effectiveness of 𝗬𝗲𝗲 declines at an alarming level. Now, unfortunately, this is not a one-off, is the immune system declines from about age 50 onwards. And what happens, unfortunately, that impairs vaccine effectiveness. In the case of 𝗬𝗲𝗲, that impairment is sort of large. Also, it's important to say I have not cherry-picked this actual example. The exact same problems are very, very apparent with sort of flu sort of vaccines. Now, the third column does show there is a way around this. Basically, you have to make a better vaccine. So even if you've got an impaired immune system, a stronger, better, more sort of potent vaccine can produce much better data. And while no vaccine is 100% effective, this particular vaccine, the third one, Shingrix, it's a new vaccine for sort of shingles, is much better. Why is it better? A, you have 2 doses used, so there's actually a booster dose. But the key thing in there is the adjuvant it uses. It's a new one. And I have to say, I use the word superlative there, and that's very, very fair comment. That same adjuvant was also recently used to develop the world's first effective malaria vaccine. And malaria, up until recently, was considered that vaccines would never actually work. That new vaccine has been used in Africa only in the last few months, and that's a huge medical sort of breakthrough. So that I'm going to mention that sort of adjuvant sort of later on. Now, the problems, of course, that we see then from this is that, unfortunately, in COVID-19, the elderly are most vulnerable to it, and yet we have this problem of the elderly. Unless you've got an absolutely top-notch vaccine, the vaccines aren't going to work as well. Second related problem, if you're looking to get herd immunity across your whole population, if your vaccines aren't very effective in older people, well, straight away, you're going to have an actual difficulty. And while there is an answer to this problem, and I've just shown you the example of sort of Shingrix, these type of very high-powered vaccines, they are slower to sort of develop, and they are harder to sort of make. In particular, on the speed issue, you often have to understand why the normal vaccines aren't working so well, and then figure out ways around that, and that all takes time. The next issue on terms is to do with sort of children. So as you noticed earlier, my descriptions of the trials, they're all run with sort of adults, and very much the culture in developing drugs is only after you launch a vaccine or a drug do you then begin trials on sort of children, because you do not want to find as a safety problem with an actual child. during a trial. That's not actually acceptable. And those trials are not sort of red tape. You often find, for instance, with vaccines that you might have to lower the dose because the body mass of the child is clearly much less than that of the typical sort of adult. You also, because of metabolic differences, you might find that if you've got more than one injection, the gap between the injections has to be sort of changed. So that then does raise problems again, unfortunately. We've mentioned earlier, because of all the time pressures, some safety tests are being corners are being cut and being skipped, but it's probably all going to be fine. There's also talk, which I don't agree with, about phase 3 trials being truncated or sort of bypassed. And also you have the background issue, which is good news, that COVID-19 doesn't affect children that much. So that then can add up to that if the regulators at the outset don't feel enough safety work has been done, they might not recommend the vaccine's use in sort of children. And even if regulators do, parents do have to sort of consent to this. And if they get a sense that full and complete safety data is not actually available, and they have a knowledge that COVID-19 doesn't affect children that much, you may get a very poor sort of take-up rate. And I think I'll be discussing this sort of later on. And the last point here is just to highlight that some vaccines don't work on infants because their immune system has not really formed up yet properly. So then on to manufacturing issues. So here I think is one of the biggest problems. So the world's target for this is going to have to be everyone on the actual planet. We've seen to date that this virus does not respect sort of national boundaries. Therefore, the only way to deal with it is to deal with it everywhere. That means all 7.8 billion people on the planet are actually going to have to sort of get it. Now, you go back to sort of capacity issues. The world's biggest selling area of vaccines are for the actual flu. And based on a survey from 2015, the world's capacity of influenza vaccine is enough to cater for about 1.5 billion people a year. A childhood vaccine, by the way, you probably need about 150 million sort of doses a year. And that's made across 35 plants all over the actual planet. Now, so you can see what we need is much bigger than that's ever been sort of done before. Now you might say, well, hold on a minute, can we not use existing vaccine plants? Well, no, you're going to cause secondary sort of pandemics if you do something like that. There are also then a number of sort of binaries to be sort of considered here. So for instance, I've discussed about DNA and RNA and also subunit vaccines that the manufacturing is changing. Unfortunately, these new methods aren't proven. So are they actually going to deliver on their sort of promises? Secondly, and a very simple point, if you look at non-elderly lives, will the vaccines actually need one dose or sort of two doses, i.e. a booster dose? If you do need a booster dose, then you don't need 8 billion doses for everyone on the planet. You need 16 billion doses for everyone on the actual sort of planet. And will the effectiveness, for instance, last more than sort of 2 to 3 years? I'd be hopeful that it would, but if it doesn't, then before you might have finished off everyone on the planet, you have to go back and sort of start again, which causes issues. And how large is the actual dose going to be required? The bigger the actual dose, the more the actual strain on the manufacturing side. I think the biggest bottleneck here in practice is something that hasn't been talked about too much in the public debate. People are focused on money, red tape, and construction issues, but I actually think it's going to be skilled people. Making vaccines is a very much a precision business. It's very safety focused. You've got to have experienced, responsible people doing that, and there's only so many of those people actually about. Clearly, there's a lot of work going on to train people up and do some other measures, but I think that's going to be a big bottleneck, and it's going to have to be sort of watched. Issues then on phase 3 trials in general. So firstly, so we're hearing a lot of talk about skipping trials and just to sort of save time. I think when you analyze it, that doesn't really make that much sense. Clearly, there's going to be more than one vaccine developed, but critically, we're going to have to figure out which is the best performing sort of vaccine. Not all vaccines are the same. Also, we're going to need safety data on a broad cross-section of the actual population. We can't find out that 2% of the population have got a very strong reaction and end up in sort of hospital afterwards. That's just not going to actually sort of work. And as we're discussing later on, everyone, even the most optimistic of the drug makers, are saying that it's not going to be until the second half of 2021 until they have ramped up their manufacturing, if everything goes right. So between now and then, there is a big window to actually get a sort of trial done. I'm also then hearing people talk about a sort of virus challenge, which is sort of need smaller numbers, and you get through that by actually deliberately infecting people with it and seeing if the vaccine sort of fights it off. I would say that approach is not tenable for sort of older lives. We all know how lethal this virus can be to older lives. You could not use those as sort of guinea pigs. That's not going to happen. And then that raises a question of which vaccine is going to be more effective for them, given the actual fall off and sort of effectiveness that will probably be seen with quite a few sort of vaccines. And secondly, I think there's an issue of misleading sort of outcomes, in that the challenge level of virus that you give may not match the real world conditions, and it can give a false view as to how effective the vaccine might actually be. Now, there was a way around this. I think the WHO proposed a design to test multiple drugs and vaccines at the sort of same time. I think this is a very good model. What this means is that you would have on each arm of the trial a different sort of vaccine, and then finally, you running in parallel, you would have one single placebo arm. Now, it's very, very efficient because this one single placebo arm is used to compare across several different vaccines at the sort of one time. Ordinarily, if you do separate trials, you need a separate sort of placebo arm, and that's very, very sort of wasteful. This is much more clever. A subtle point, but very important. If you're joining a normal vaccine trial, your chances of actually getting the vaccine versus placebo is typically 50-50. In this type of trial, the chance of getting the placebo is probably less than sort of 20%. Therefore, people will enroll quicker. Also, because of the structure of this trial, you don't need to do a second sort of phase 3 trial. And then last but not least, you do get a definitive comparison between the sort of vaccines, which is going to, as I said above, is actually very, very important. So that's all I want to say at the moment for vaccines. I'm going to come back to that subject later. Now, again, moving quickly on, we've lots of content to sort of get through here. I want to move on to antivirals. So antivirals background. So what is an antiviral? Well, very, very quickly, it's any drug that directly attacks the actual virus and does so independent of the immune system. In comparison to vaccines, they're often just tablets, and therefore the manufacturing is very quick and it's actually highly sort of scalable. And we've had some great successes with antivirals. It has led to HIV being completely sort of controlled. And in the last 5 years, we've been able to cure hepatitis C, which not quite known to the public, but had become the biggest infectious disease killer across the whole sort of planet, even more so than malaria. It's now been stopped in its actual tracks. Unfortunately, the specific approaches we've been using for those two viruses are not applicable against COVID-19. Although I should stress, HIV is mentioned here, and hepatitis C, vaccines don't work, so virals are absolutely sort of essential there. I think a fairer comparison in terms of what we can expect on antivirals for COVID-19 is to look at the case of influenza, which there also are antivirals. The benefits are much more modest, and I think that will set expectations better. So the following table here, if you go from left to right, it shows the 4 antivirals that have been approved to treat influenza. The second one is the format that the person takes the antiviral in, and it does sort of vary. I'll come back to that point in a second. Next, in terms of the phase 3 trials, how much of a benefit were they able to actually demonstrate? And really what they showed was pretty consistently that the amount of time you actually have the flu, and in these cases that you had to go to hospital for it, your rate of recovery was about 1 day quicker, which is not that much. None of these 4 were also able to demonstrate a mortality benefit. And also a constraint on these antivirals was they need to be used within 2 days of the symptoms sort of first showing. After that, they don't tend to show any sort of benefit. However, so that's not good news. The good news was in terms of prevention. So this is these are separate trials run, not when you actually had the illness, but almost like a vaccine you're taking on a daily basis, or alternatively like when you take sort of preventive medication for malaria. So you take that daily. What they were able to show in trials was that it prevented a huge amount of people getting the sort of flu, up to 80 to sort of 90% in sort of several sort of cases. Now, critically, if you're going to be using these antivirals for prevention, they do require daily dosing. And in reality, you can't be injecting yourself sort of daily. You do require ideally in sort of tablet sort of format. And I want you to keep that point in sort of mind. So moving on to antivirals. So you certainly just in the last few days, you've probably heard a lot of news about an antiviral called Remdesivir, if I pronounced that properly. I've been looking at that since last January. I always felt this was a very promising antiviral. It was originally developed to tackle Ebola in Africa and showed itself to be moderately sort of effective. Now, it was a bit of a lucky break here from our point of view, in that Ebola and COVID-19, while clearly they're different viruses, they are structurally similar in how they store their RNA. And this is how this antiviral actually attacks the actual virus. And it turns out they're very, very similar. And it was always thought, once we knew about COVID-19, that this particular antiviral might actually work. So there's several large phase 3 trials underway. One in China that reported a couple of weeks ago gave poor results. I don't think that was a well-structured trial. I think it wasn't, the outcome was overly harsh. It could have been better sort of designed. Then a US-led trial only came out with news on Wednesday, and that was, to my opinion, very, very good. So it reduced recovery time by sort of 4 days, which is, as you can see, better than the flu antivirals. And importantly, I think this is very helpful for hospital capacity. And I always thought that was going to be the benefit. Now, on top of that, it showed a reduced mortality, which fell from 11.6% of people on the trial to 8% in terms of placebo and the active arm. It wasn't statistically significant, but it was only a smidgen off. And this trial was not powered for that to be statistically significant. The fact that it got so close, to my mind, is a very pleasant surprise. I think those numbers are actually real. The downside, it hasn't been publicly mentioned so far, and I'm disappointed it hasn't been. Sadly, the Remdesivir, the way the chemistry is organized, it can't be formatted through sort of tablets. It's just not possible. I've been asked this question, it just can't be done. It can only be given through an IV drip format. And of course, an IV drip is even worse than a daily injection. So you cannot in practice use it for a preventative format, which I think which is very frustrating, because I think it would be very, very useful. Now, I would point out there is another drug of an antiviral of a similar class called Remdesivir, and you can even see the names are sort of fairly similar. It's the same type of format as Remdesivir. It is currently in phase 1 against COVID-19, again using IV drip format. But critically, having read up several of the papers, you can see there in that it actually can be formatted in tablet dosing, and has been done so in the sort of past. So I think that's actually sort of one to sort of watch. Now, sadly, no other current antivirals are showing that much promise, and clearly there's a lot of work underway to develop new antiviral classes. But given they are starting from scratch and have to do work that's never been done before, and lots of trial and error, honestly, I wouldn't really expect anything out of that for the next 4 to sort of 5 years. Hope, it could happen better, but I think that's a much better estimate to have in your mind. Okay, moving on then to antibodies. So if you look at an actual vaccine, the vaccine itself doesn't do anything for you. All it does is it induces the immune system to make antibodies. So the idea has been around for a while of, hold on a minute, how else can we get the relevant antibodies into the actual patient to help them fight off an infection or actually prevent it in the sort of first place? And I'm glad to say there are 2 practical examples where this has actually happened. One is with a virus called RSV, which you mightn't have heard of, but it's quite a dangerous influenza-like virus, certainly very dangerous to the frail and elderly, and also to newborn children. And there has been a treatment there since 1998. It has to be used on a monthly basis, and for children, it was found to reduce levels of RSV infection by about a half. Now, the last couple of years, ones have been developed against Ebola. I list the names there. These are engineered, again, Ebola antibodies that have been refined through research to be very, very potent antibodies, and then sort of mass produced. Now, in a landmark phase 3 trial, they were shown to have a mortality rate of about 30% if a person got infected and was then injected with the antibodies afterwards. That may seem high, 30%, but bear in mind other medicines were being used in different arms of those trials, and it showed that those people had 50% mortality. And I think the most important one that came out for me of those trials was for those people who got injected with the antibodies very shortly after getting Ebola, they only had a 10% mortality rate. So I think in that context, 50 versus 10% is a dramatic sort of difference. Now, in terms of what we can do for COVID-19, the first one is something that's actually available right now. And I've been banging my hand on tables in the last couple of months about this point, is what's known as convalescent plasma. This is a strategy that's been around since the 1890s. Very, very simple. You take plasma from a recovered patient and you basically just give it to someone who's currently ill. The plasma from the recovered patient will contain antibodies because they can't have fought the thing off unless they formed antibodies. Then those antibodies in the patient, they in turn then help to fight off the infection for the person who's actually currently ill. Several initial trials have indicated the benefits for COVID-19 there, and there are large proper phase 3 type trials now underway that will give answers, I think, in the next few months. I would make an observation here. I think it's prudent that national blood collection systems start to think through the implications if these trials are successful, because in a way they will become the manufacturing body. They will hopefully find all the people in Ireland, for instance, who've had COVID-19, try and persuade them to give plasma donations, and then collect those, test them, and then pass them on to hospitals for use in those who are currently ill. Last but not least, then there are several COVID-19 engineered antibodies in sort of development. Now, clearly they're starting from sort of scratch, but they are working through at a very, very quick pace. And one of the key developers that I have my eye on has said that they will start their trials in late summer 2020. And this is the same company that actually developed one of the antibodies for Ebola, and certainly that was a clear-cut success. They said they're following the exact same format as they used for sort of Ebola. Importantly, it looks like these trials will skip phase 1 and go straight into sort of phase 2. The issue is if you've got people in hospital with sort of COVID-19, the risk-benefit calculation changes. You don't have to do phase 1 safety. Just give it to the actual people who may be at a danger of sort of dying. So antibodies are a very promising area, not hearing much about in the sort of media, but I think outside of vaccines for me is the most promising area. So then on to repurposing sort of medicines. So in terms of, I think I wanted to divide this up. COVID-19, again, I think the media could be doing better to sort of describe what's going on here. In reality, it's two separate diseases. One is the viral infection, which is what everyone has been focused on. There's a second thing I'm going to label as CRS. So CRS is a well-known medical term. It stands for cytokine release syndrome. And what that is referring to is the immune system is over-responding to the viral infection. And unfortunately, the level of over-response gets out of control, and it starts to actually impose severe costs on the body. And that can escalate again, and sadly, it can end up being sort of lethal. And a lot of the COVID-19 deaths in practice are coming from people with lung-related conditions, and that's not primarily the virus itself that's causing that. It is this CRS phenomenon, which does go by other names. I choose to call it CRS. So then the debate becomes for CRS is, can you get the immune system just to kind of calm down? And it turns out there are lots of drugs around that are aimed precisely at sort of doing that. The first class I'm going to talk about here is IL-6 inhibitors. So we know from research done already, particularly in fairness in sort of China from the early days, that the particular way the immune system is getting out of control in the context of COVID-19 is through a mechanism in the immune system referred to as IL-6. The immune system, by the way, has lots of different tricks, lots of different sort of pathways. IL-6 is one of those pathways. There are actually 3 existing IL-6 drugs that are actually available that calm down that particular pathway. They're interestingly used for rheumatoid arthritis, and you may not be aware of this, but rheumatoid arthritis is also caused by your immune system getting out of sort of control. And so, very importantly, there are other mechanisms to turn down the immune system. For instance, if you take something as basic as sort of steroids, that will turn down the immune system. The trouble is, it'll turn all the immune system off. But you need the immune system to be up and functioning to fight the actual virus. So turning off IL-6 leaves the rest of the immune system working, and that should be enough for the sort of patient. Now they actually have, and it didn't get much media attention, there was a phase 3 trial that reported out only at the start of this week. Now sadly, it failed that trial, but they were using it on a broad category of COVID-19 patients. And when they did some sub-analysis, what they found, people who were critically ill, i.e. those on sort of ventilators. And by the way, they're the most likely ones that the CRS is probably the actual sort of culprit. They found that there was a very decent response there across about 100 plus patients. And they're now going to run a secondary phase 3 trial purely focusing on these critically ill people to see if it makes a difference. I'd be reasonably confident that it would. Unfortunately, it looks like it's only going to be of use on critically ill people, but that's where all the mortality is sort of coming from. So that is important for us to sort of watch. Second class, I'm grouping these two together. These two other in class of inhibitors referred to as BTK drugs and JAK drugs. And BTK and JAK drugs are both used, they're both new classes of drugs, they're used to treat blood cancers. So things like leukemia or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. What those particular forms of cancer actually, again, it's the immune system is the actual culprit, a very awkward character sometimes. This is where parts of the immune system actually themselves turn cancerous, and that can cause problems in the body. It can actually escalate, and in the end, it can and will prove sort of fatal to sort of many sort of people. What these drugs do is they turn down those aspects of the immune system that are turning sort of cancerous. Both have actually evidence to date that they actually will reduce CRS in COVID-19. And importantly, from my point of view, it is what I would call the sort of big pharma companies that are saying that they think the BTK and JAK classes might hold promise. I put a lot of faith when a big pharma company says something like these are big organizations, there are lots of checks and balances. When they say something publicly, behind it privately, there's often a lot of sort of sound sort of science. So moving on then, so that's pretty much on the CRS side. On the viral infection itself, now when I first heard about COVID-19, which is actually on New Year's Day and was reading about it, you could immediately see it was going to be a huge problem because of the R0 number. But people were already starting to talk about antivirals. And I have to say, I didn't buy that because the practical experience of finding existing drugs that can be used to treat viruses is actually not that good. I'm only aware of 3 specific examples of all the viruses that we know about and all the drugs that we have that we're able to repurpose 3 drugs to treat particular viruses. Now, I said before, COVID-19, we should not be showing it too much sort of reverence. It is just another virus. It is got aspects of it that means it's actually dangerous, but it is just another virus. It is not like HIV. It is not that special. So if we take that viewpoint, therefore, I could not understand why people would be so optimistic that we could find so many other drugs to repurpose against it, where for so many other viruses, we've actually sort of struggled. It just didn't make any sense. Now, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but there's been a lot of trials published, and some of them have received huge attention, and some prominent politicians have talked about the actual results. To me, when I've looked into those trials, I have to say, been very, very disappointed. I mentioned earlier some of the problems on sort of phase 2 trials, that the way the company controls the actual trial and how that often produces better results than might otherwise be the case. So down here, I list a number of potential sort of red flags that I would be looking at as a biotech investor in terms of how trials are being sort of conducted and how the news is being disseminated. And for a lot of these trials for repurposing COVID-19, I have to be honest with you, a lot of these flags are being sort of ticked. Certainly, for instance, to quote one example, you've probably heard of the drug hydrochloroquine and a prominent French study that was published several weeks ago. I did read through the report about that particular trial, and I would say, from my personal point of view, every single red flag I put up there was relevant to that particular trial. So maybe that drug will show some good. I don't want to be too sort of negative, but that trial was not the actual trial to answer that sort of question. So moving then on. So on terms of future sort of scenarios, this is a lot of the science is now behind us. So in terms of a vaccine rollout, I think mentally I'm dividing it into sort of 3 stages as going to be appropriate. I've talked through stage 1. So this is where we wouldn't have completed phase 3 trials yet. But in the background, people are producing vaccines. They have run phase 2 trials. There is some data. So there is the capacity to actually start vaccinating some people. But given we don't have all the information, issues about risk, benefit, and capacity are actually paramount, and therefore it's going to be quite restricted as to who actually gets the actual vaccine. Stage 2, this refers to when we have done these sort of phase 3 trials, when the manufacturing has been sort of scaled up, and very simply we give it to the whole population, the adults, the elderly, children, anyone and everyone who actually sort of wants it. Stage 3, I think, is a kind of, you could perhaps call it stage 2B, I'm going to go with call it stage 3. This is where we realize that there's a problem with the elderly, that they need a top-notch vaccine. And so I'm going to call that a Shingrix class vaccine that we discussed earlier, likely to be sort of 2-dose. Now, the issue is that, as I mentioned earlier, this type of higher functioning, more powerful vaccine is liable to take longer to actually design, test, and critically to sort of manufacture. So it's going to be constrained production, and this stage will start after phase 2. Ironically, given the urgency with the elderly for this particular disease, even on stage 2, when the vaccine may not be that good, I think in fairness, the elderly should be at the front of the actual queue. And then the plan here would be that we would revaccinate the elderly, which I'm going to call 60 plus. In this particular instance, there's 1 billion people worldwide. They can get a second vaccine, this time the really good one. And by the way, there is no problem giving people 2 vaccines for the one sort of virus. There are no issues there. So those are the 3 stages. Now, a question on stage 1 as to who actually gets it, because as I said before, we are sort of constrained. Now, regulators have already said, and I agree with this, it makes perfect sense to me, is that health workers will actually get it first. The concept there is certainly in terms of benefit, they are being heavily exposed to the virus in terms of their treatment, and sadly we've seen, of lots and lots of sort of illnesses and sort of deaths there. In terms of risk, these are typically young to middle-aged people. There's a selective effect for being actually at sort of work, so they are overall in sort of reasonable health. You're not taking huge sort of safety risks. And also, it's a fairly constrained part of the population. There should be enough volume there to sort of handle that. The next one I'd like to, this is a favorite tactic of mine. I'm again disappointed that the media have not talked more about this. I think this is going to be a very important tool going forward. This is called as a ring treatment strategy. So a ring treatment strategy for a virus pandemic. So, what this means is you find someone who's actually infected through the kind of trace contact test type program. And what you do is you get everyone who's actually around, every contact of that person who's been infected, and you immediately give them the actual vaccine. Then in turn, all those people who you vaccinated, you uncover who their contact list is. Then you go to those people and you also give them the actual vaccine. And what you have, if you stand back from it, you have essentially trapped the virus inside a double-layered protected ring of people who have received the actual vaccine. So in pejorative terms, you put a ring of steel around that one infected sort of person, and the virus is then trapped, and then you treat that patient. This approach has been very successfully used with sort of Ebola in Africa in the last couple of sort of years. And also, it was originally devised back in the 1970s in the final campaigns to eradicate sort of smallpox, which again took place in Africa. And one comment I would make here, I'm conscious that we're all looking at saying we should look at places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Germany for lessons as to how to treat this pandemic, and those comments are valid. I think we should be a bit less proud and be willing to look at how Africa is dealing with these type of situations. They have a large number of infectious diseases to deal with. They have HIV, they have malaria, they have Ebola, and there's sort of several others. They have developed a lot of low-tech, low-cost, common sense, highly effective ways in both in methods and sort of culture as to how to sort of behave. And I think we could learn lessons from South Africa. I'm frustrated that we keep looking at only the advanced economies for sort of ideas. Importantly, this could become a carrot as well. So i.e. we're going to go into a lot of testing and tracing in the next few months. We're going to be telling people to sort of stay at home. And if you're going to be asking all those things of people, if you give them a carrot of an actual upfront vaccine, you could be doing an awful lot of sort of good. Next point is, I think there's a debate needed on sort of care homes. Clearly, there, you know, we've had some terrible news there, and we could see a lot of benefit from using early use of vaccines. My only concern is the risk profile is not going to be fully sort of known, and you're dealing with elderly, frail people with lots of comorbidities. A not fully tested vaccine is actually a bit of a risk, and there has to be a debate on that point. I personally would tend towards saying vaccinate, but if someone had the opposite viewpoint, they could sort of well be sort of right. Okay, so moving on then. So this is an important table, and so this is what I would see a practical sort of rollout happening here of the various stages I've just discussed. And I've put 3 scenarios here of starting and end for stage 1, 2, and 3. And clearly by the labels from left to right, we're starting off optimistic and then getting less optimistic sort of towards the right. You can see for the first scenario, really it's the second half of 2023 is what I'm saying. Second one, 24, 25, third one, 26. Now I'm conscious that people would have hoped to have seen, if I was going to show this table, that we would through this sort of quicker. This is very much a guesstimate from my point of view. It is indeed very, very speculative, as the sort of title says. I would draw your attention though to the monthly run rate. So I have kind of worked backwards and says, well, hold on a minute. If you have these start points and end points, how much vaccine are you having to produce per month? And you can see the actual numbers there. Now, if you choose quicker than this, you'll have to have higher sort of run rates. There's no way around that. Now, even on the third scenario, which is the most pessimistic one, and to be clear, I don't believe that scenario is. It's not my favorite. I did want to show it though. You are producing of the order of 210 million doses per sort of month. Now, even at that level, you're more than 1.5 times the run rate of, at the moment, where it takes 35 factories worldwide to produce flu sort of vaccines. So I would say that run rate is not that pessimistic, to be fair, by the only available sort of yardstick that we actually have. If you want to say that, by the way, I should say, clearly you can construct scenarios where the finish stage is actually quicker than what I have shown. But then you're getting into stupendous levels of sort of run rates. And I would think if you did produce such a scenario, it probably should be called "This Time It's Different." And the "This Time It's Different" scenario doesn't actually work out that well. The key point here, of course, is I have assumed equitable worldwide distribution. Now, and we've been seeing signs of that already, but in practice, if the second and third scenarios crystallize, it's not rocket science to say that developed countries who have the clout and money and the sort of science may favor their own citizens first. I can understand that. All I would add though is this illness will not go away until we vaccinate everybody. So also this is another important table. And so this is, if we did go through the whole vaccination program, how much of the population would end up having immunity against COVID-19. And I've looked at this across 6 different countries, including sort of Ireland, with different sort of demographics. And I've had 6 scenarios here, and really they're in groups of sort of 3. So the first 3 scenarios you see from left to right, this is saying that we go through all of stage 2, but we don't really uncover a Shingrix-like vaccine that is very effective on sort of the actual elderly. So clearly that's not a great scenario. Also, then I then examine what if no children actually end up taking the vaccine because regulators think it's not very safe. 2, half children take it up, i.e. parents have got doubts. And the third one, all children, in that there are no doubts and everyone's happy. And then the second batch of 3 scenarios is more optimistic. It assumes, yes, we get through stage 2. We also find a Shingrix type vaccine. It's actually very effective, and we give that to the actual elderly. And the way this is constructed is, I've set out the assumptions in Appendix B, which you can download later if you so desire. Is red means no, you're not going to hit sort of herd immunity. Yellow means maybe, and clearly there are doubts as to what our 0 actually is, for instance. And green means yes, we should be safe at that level. And so what this is saying is, we do need pretty much full children take up to happen. There is some margin, but not much. And we do definitely need a stage 3 Shingrix class vaccine to be sort of found and sort of applied to the elderly. And one last comment, and you can see the example of Nigeria. I did want to have a representative of the developing world here. That because of their very skewed demographics towards children, they absolutely have to have confidence that they can give these vaccines to sort of children. Otherwise, they end up with a very, very poor outcome. So also, what if a vaccination can't in fact provide a full herd immunity? Now, one point, again, the media should be talking more about is vaccines is not just a binary that they prevent you getting the actual illness. There's also the secondary issue that if you do get the illness with the vaccine, example after example shows that you get a less severe version. So for instance, children who get the vaccine against the mumps and measles end up sometimes still getting those two diseases, but they get a very, very mild versions of them. And I think that's fairly well understood. I'll show the study here for influenza vaccines. I won't spend too much time in it, but you can see that the vaccinated group versus the unvaccinated group in terms of Spanish hospitals had materially better outcomes of ICU, CRS and lungs, organ failure, and that despite being the fact that this vaccinated group is actually older and sort of frailer than the unvaccinated group. So therefore, if we are short in terms of a full vaccination project in terms of herd immunity, in reality, it's going to have to be, unfortunately, infections that will be required to sort of bridge that gap. However, if the vaccines are actually significantly reducing the severity of the illness for the remaining cohort who actually get infected, and we have some more medicines who on top of that will lower the actual outcomes as well, it's not going to be like the current dreadful situation we've had in the past weeks and months. I would be confident of that. But it's yet another reason why we need to do phase 3 trials, because those trials will actually reveal for those who still get infected with the vaccine, how much of a lower level of illness did they actually sort of get. Okay, moving on then, I'm conscious here of time. So here we have timelines for the other drugs that I've been discussing earlier. So I've listed them all out. So the second column shows the quarters when I would expect data just to sort of come out. The third column shows my personal estimates of regulatory success. Now bear in mind, regulatory success will be issues like time to recovery, percentage of people entering ICU. The one I think I'm more interested in does actually show signs of reducing sort of mortality. Again, I think these trials will be underpowered to statistically demonstrate that. So trends are what we're going to get. Trends are stroke signals. And last but not least is when these medicines should be available. And thankfully, because most of them are on the market already, there's not much of an actual gap here. It's not like sort of vaccines. As you can see, the one I'm most anticipating are the engineered antibodies that I discussed earlier. Unfortunately, they're going to be last to sort of report out given their development cycle, but they're the ones I would keep a very, very close eye on. Now, then I'm coming towards the end, just a couple of broader points. Clearly what's happened at the moment is dreadfully unfortunate. You know, history has shown pandemics do happen, but they can be very infrequent. You know, this 20th century we had 1918 flu vaccine and there's a 57, 58 Hong Kong flu. So maybe once every 50 or 60 years. What I would say is, from going through all the things I've been discussing here and my own knowledge of biotech, the last 5 years have seen great strides in the available sort of viral science. I've been very impressed and very heartened even before this whole thing happened. Anyone who's involved in biotech would certainly sort of say similar comments. I've given a long list of things that simply were not there sort of 5 years ago. If I really wanted to, I could have had 2 more slides full of similar sort of bullet points. And so to my take on it is where we are today in terms of the actual science, that we're in a very difficult position, but there certainly are solutions that are in the end will actually work. If it was only 5 years ago, I would have summarized our position as we were in a really difficult position and the science may not be there to actually solve the actual problem itself. And so I'm very struck by how much of a 5-year difference is actually made here. And I appreciate the drug industry often gets a very bad rep for overpricing and so on and so forth. I do understand those concerns, but they do plow a lot of those profits back into sort of R&D. And in fairness, they have also ignored this background issue, which I didn't have much time for either, of antibiotic resistance, which is a moderate long-term problem. The drug industry saw it differently. When it came to infectious diseases, they saw the problems were always with sort of viral infections, and that's what they were focusing on, and that's what they were grinding out sort of results. And I think we should be very grateful that those decisions were made in the last sort of 5 years. Okay, My final comment then, I'm moving away from the science, perhaps just to make a brief allusion to the actual recovery, and this is more of a philosophical point of view, that as you can see from my slides, that the various science steps, there's not one magic day or one magic outcome. There's many, many stages and trials and so on and so forth. So we are on, certainly with the science, we're on a journey, and this journey will have ups and downs. We will have some dead ends, but we are going to get there. But it is a journey of many steps. And I'm noticing a lot of public commentary about when will things get back to normal? Is it 21? Is it 22? Second half of 22, for instance. This idea of a one-off binary, I think, is not very useful. We need to look at each actual step and how much improvement that sort of brings to us. Second point, again, very philosophical. I just think the idea of hope is very, very powerful. And what I mean here is that if people can see that the vaccine factories have been built, that the data from the phase 3 trials is good, that the run rate per month of production is decent, but even though it still might be showing 23, 24 when it will all be done, they will have confidence that we're going to get there. I think that sense of hope means economic recovery could then start to front run the delivery of the actual science. We won't know, but I would have some confidence that will actually happen. And a lot depends on how the scientists and the pharma companies talk to the public and explain the actual progress that they're sort of making. Also, when all this is finished, I know I hear comments about, when are we going to go back to sort of normal? I think that normal is now in the past and is a different sort of country. Where we're going to be, there will be a new normal and it's going to be different. But I think many of the changes we're seeing are actually quite helpful. Like certainly in the Irish context, I think a lot of the commute into the Dublin region was becoming very productive. It was destabilizing the sort of property market. We might not realize there's actually a different way to organize our sort of country. And finally, I just threw up, I thought, some speculative links between the implementing the science and where the recovery might be sort of seen in various parts of the actual economy. So one, again, I'm on the healthcare committee. It's a personal view. Certainly it's not the healthcare committee's viewpoint. But for instance, if all, in stage 1, if all the medical staff in Ireland were to get the actual vaccine, I think that would give a lot more confidence, particularly of the elderly, to sort of re-engage with sort of private healthcare and go in and see their doctor and have procedures done if they feel that environment is now safer for them. And certainly we could see much more activity there, which I think, by the way, is very important from a public health perspective. So we're now at the end of my presentation. I'm conscious I had to go through things very, very quickly. I hope you're able to follow it. I hope I was able to explain the points clearly to you. Before I hand back to the chairman, as I had to make this presentation very, very quickly, I did get some assistance and I would like to give some credit. So first, I'd like to credit two members, two fellows of this society. Firstly, Donald Casey, who was very generous with his time for me, gave me a lot of very useful advice and sort of feedback. I'd also then like to thank 𝗘𝗃𝗲𝗿, who I may have, robbed, I'm going to say, borrowed a couple of his actual ideas, and thanks for that. And in a shocking display of nepotism, I'd like to thank my own brother, Sean, who at very short notice gave me some very useful feedback on an earlier sort of draft of this presentation. And with that, I'll now pass you back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivor. I suppose that was a very good, very detailed presentation. We do have some questions on the Q&A and a couple of hands up. I suppose before we get into that, I do have a question myself. Antivirals like Remdesivir, you mentioned that they were good at prevention effectiveness, but I suppose, with the timelines you've outlined, you've talked on slide 8, up to 7 years to come up with a vaccine, your own timelines of 2023, a lot of politicians and pharma companies saying 2021. I guess before we have a vaccine, if we went down the antiviral route and, we were trying to get some sense of normality back, with 7 billion people on the planet, we clearly can't give them tablets on a daily basis. Is it a targeted approach, or what's the best way to try and tackle this in the absence of a vaccine so we can get back to normal?
Yeah, again, I suppose, again, I think I would back to my comment first that this is going to be a journey. I don't think we can have this binary state of sort of going back to normal. In terms of the medications, I suppose we have decent data that Remdesivir is now sort of useful, and there's another trial that is being run that will give us more information. They are currently ramping up production. They will, I think, have about, by the year end, have a monthly run rate of something like 100 to 200,000 sort of treatments. So at that level, Remdesivir is for people who are actually ill and actually have to sort of go to sort of hospital. For that class of people, it could reduce the mortality by about sort of 25% or so. I do think that in the next few months, the IL-6 class and the other ones I mentioned, like BTK, we will have data on those by the year end. I'd be hopeful that one or two of those show benefits. My personal instinct is they will, in a combined sense, maybe reduce the mortality by about a third to a sort of half from what we've seen in sort of recent months. Now that's everything going right. And again, I'm showing risk elements about trials that sort of not sort of working. I think that's the best we can do in the sort of short term, to be honest. You know, we're very unfortunate that this Remdesivir one, its chemistry only allows it to be used in this IV drip. If it were available in tablet form, it would, in my opinion, for instance, it would be given almost like stage one. It would be medical staff that would be given it on a daily basis. I think people in old care homes would be given it. You would reduce a lot of our practical problems that way. But you're fair to say 8 billion people can't have it sort of daily. So I think, unfortunately, you know, it's outside the scope of my presentation, but it's a lot of the social distancing stuff is going to have to remain, maybe obviously not as strict as it is now, but maybe 2/3 to half of the current level is going to have to be kept up, certainly well into sort of next year. Clearly, as people start to get vaccinated, the R0 starts to come down. I think you can use that to sort of trade off your various sort of lockdown issues. But that's where we are. I don't see, on the basis of the science and my knowledge of the pharma industry, any quick wins that gets around the idea of having to have a sort of vaccine.
Okay. I suppose the questions have been flooding in now, Ivor. We've
Okay.
9 here. Now,
Okay.
some are just general comments just on how excellent the presentation was. But I suppose, just starting off, I have a question here from Michael McCarthy, just asking, you know, any comment on Oxford University and AstraZeneca vaccine? They are saying it could be available by late September this year.
Yeah, that it's funny enough. The vaccines I actually discussed in my notes, I did ones that actually had manufacturing deals lined up. And frustratingly, the AstraZeneca one only came out till yesterday morning, and frankly, at that stage, it was too late to be changed my slides. So that has come into the frame the last couple of weeks. Certainly, the AstraZeneca one to me is very, very eye-catching. AstraZeneca, it's a UK pharma company. They have an excellent reputation on R&D. They've had great strides and developments in the last couple of years. For instance, that BTK drug that I mentioned earlier on in my slides, that actually is from AstraZeneca, for instance. So I looked at their words yesterday from their CEO. His phrasing was very deliberate, and I think they have data that's a very good vaccine. So that has moved quicker than I would have thought. Now, again, I need to stress some of the actual language that's been used publicly. It's fair to say that the Oxford people did say that it'd be available from September. But I think this is an example of us perhaps hearing what we might want to hear. They said available. They didn't say available to everybody, which I think is what some people are hoping might be the case. So they will have a low production runs, perhaps about 1 million doses per sort of month. At that level, for instance, they will probably use it on the UK health system, for instance, and perhaps then give some abroad to other sort of healthcare systems, I would speculate. But that level of sort of availability, it goes back to what I said about sort of stage 1 vaccination, where you've very preliminary news that a vaccine is working, you have some supply, and you have to make some very hard decisions about who actually sort of gets it. But I think the key word, I've seen it several times, people are using the word available. I know politicians in the US, for instance, are using that phrase a lot. But you watch what they say very, very closely. They don't say available to sort of everybody. And I think they're smart in just using the word available, knowing what people will actually imply afterwards. So yes, that Oxford vaccine, because of particularly the tie-up deal that they've got with AstraZeneca. Also, I did read separately, they've got a tied-up deal with a prominent Indian company called Serum, a big vaccine maker. And again, they think highly. So that is certainly a very promising one. But just to be clear, like even there, like if they produced about 1 billion doses a year, which sounds very good, that only gets you through a NATO of the world's population, maybe even less in sort of practice. So you need almost 8 vaccines like that with that level of sort of production if you were to try and solve this problem inside sort of 1 year. And that's why I start having major doubts about the sort of realism of people who say this all can be done by 2022. To my mind, it's a sort of 2-year deal that we have 8 billion people on the planet. We are going to have to revaccinate everyone over age 60. To my mind, that's about 10 billion doses. In reality, a few of the vaccines are also sort of 2-dose vaccines that I'm seeing data on. That implies 13, 14 billion doses in sort of practice. When you look at it that way, even if you're producing 1 billion doses a year by, say, AstraZeneca, it would take them 14 years on their own to solve it. So I think 7 companies like AstraZeneca producing 1 billion a year over 2 years solves the actual problem. And that's where I came up with my scenario that I used earlier on in this presentation.
Okay. Robert Wolf has a question. So any thoughts on the affordability of vaccines or other treatments?
Yeah, I did give this some thought. I actually referenced there an Indian company, Serum. I was interested in this question myself. The CEO there actually wasn't promptly said. He did quote that if he was manufacturing the Oxford one in mass production, that he would be selling in India. He did say he was going to go to India first for $15 an actual sort of treatment. Now, that would be a lower estimate because it's being developed, manufactured in the developing world and distributed there as well. That does sort of lower down costs. The other extreme might be if we take sort of 𝗉𝗃, the top of the range complicated vaccine. That's currently available in the US for $280 for a 2-dose schedule. Now, I would say the makers there, Glaxo, are doing quite well. I would estimate their margins about 50%. So they could be bargained down in terms of mass production down to, say, $140 for a 2-dose vaccine. But if you were to convert that down to, say, to a 1-dose logic, that's $70. So I think per dose, we are looking at a possible range from anywhere up from $15 up to $70 per sort of person, depending on the complexity of the actual vaccine involved. In practice, in an Irish context, say I might nail that down to a range of 25 to 50 euros per person. It's approximately 5 million people in Ireland, so that's of the order of 125 to 250 million euros required to vaccinate everybody, which is a lot of money, but I would say it's almost costing us that much every sort of couple of days at the moment. So the cost-benefit analysis is very, very strong. So the cost won't be a problem, even for the developing world, I think. They might need some support. It's just the sort of manufacturing problems that I think will sort of hurt us here. And to be fair to the pharma companies, they are saying they don't expect to make money off this because they expect it to be more or less a sort of a one-off issue. They are asking for some state backing because some of their factories are going to build aren't going to be usable afterwards. I think that's actually fair. But a lot of them have spent money the last few months with no chance really of making it back in terms of sort of profit. And I know people can be cynical about them sometimes, and that cynicism is often well sort of founded. But in this case, I think they have been very good sort of corporate sort of citizens.
Okay. There's an anonymous question here. What are the risks of vaccination trials resulting in other medical issues, for example, cancer links or disability?
Very, very low is the honest answer. I went through all the sort of safety steps that they've done. They have very well-founded ways of sort of testing this out. All the adjuvants I've mentioned before that will be used, like, you know, for instance, in sort of 𝗉𝗃, that same adjuvant is being used in 7 different vaccines at the moment. So that safety profile is known. The actual techniques are very, very similar. What you're introducing to the body is elements of the actual virus, as I said before, that are often dead, that they are organic. I have to say, ideas of cancer and stuff are, I have to be a bit tough about this, that I would regard that as sort of fanciful and not sort of helpful. I have to be a bit tough about that. There's just no science to it. This is kind of sounds like to me the edge of the anti-vax type campaign, which has caused huge harm. So it's fair to say these concerns have to be answered and people have to have assurances. And there is a strong, I think, more that needs to be done than is currently being done in terms of transparency with the public about the various tests that these various vaccines have done, like what the Oxford group, what tests that they performed on tissue samples and animals. I think they should be more transparent there. I think that's where there is some grounds for sort of changes. But as regards vaccine causing cancers and so on and so forth, no, I have to say that's fairly sort of fanciful.
Okay, Eamon Kelly has a question here. What is the level of cooperation or not between different players in the space, and how will that affect the likely development of these medicines over the next 1 to 2 years?
I think it's actually quite sort of good. I suppose what we have here is a mismatch between some of the people who are very good at developing vaccines are not necessarily skilled at the manufacturing side. So what you've seen is some of the big pharma companies, like we saw AstraZeneca just discussed earlier with the Oxford group. Also, you have Pfizer in the US has lined up with BioNTech, which is a German manufacturer of RNA vaccines, new company, very promising science, but no sort of manufacturing heft. So that's a link up. The one I would point people's attention to is Sanofi of France and Glaxo of the UK. So Sanofi, they are developing a vaccine. They have probably quite a good modern subunit sort of manufacturing process, which they've already used on a flu vaccine, and they can get very high yields from it. What they don't have is a decent adjuvant. And now they've traditionally been huge competitors with the British Glaxo company, but in the last couple of weeks, they went out of their way. The two of them managed to do an actual deal together. And these are cutthroat competitors, very, very proud companies. And also they are national champions for Britain and France, respectively. They've cut a deal where they're basically sharing all their sort of science together. And often they will be showing each other the tricks of their sort of trade to each other for that, which they would not normally do in a sort of million years. So I was very heartened to see things like that happen. And again, all the other deals that are happening on the sort of manufacturing side. I do think this is showing the pharma industry in a better light than the public has had that image of them now, where again, I would accept there has been some misbehavior on sort of pricing that has been very, very damaging. But the companies are doing some very, very good work here, I do sort of believe. Bear in mind, most of them are run by sort of scientists themselves. Many have a background in vaccines directly, and know exactly, and are also would have been previously sort of doctors, and they would have treated sort of patients, so they understand better than sort of most what's actually at sort of stake here.
Okay. So the questions have been flooding in, Ivor. We've 16 here now. And I don't think we're going to be able to get through them all.
No.
But we'll give it a stab.
Yeah.
I suppose the question here from Jenny Quigley, I suppose presumably with so much of the world's medical research focused on COVID-19, what are the risks that research into other illnesses get completely sidelined? Or how might that play out in the future?
Yeah, I thought obviously I'm a big investor, as I mentioned, of biotech companies. I currently have holdings in about 25 separate sort of biotech companies, so it's a big issue for me personally, so I'm watching that closely. The answer is not so much, thankfully. What people are saying is that enrollment of some trials has slowed down or even stopped, particularly if the trials are being run in sort of hospitals. That the hospitals are clearly very, very busy, and anything that's just not essential is just being stopped. Now, that has been graded. So, for instance, a trial for an illness like, say, rheumatoid arthritis could easily be stopped. There are good sort of treatments there, but there are a lot of, say, research going on for, say, sort of cancer trials for advanced cancer. Those trials, the general consensus is they are moving ahead as per normal. I think even the hospitals, as stretched as they are, saying they can't compromise on those trials. So, the issues there, I would say it's not that bad as people might have thought. I do think there might be an opportunity cost, sadly, on the vaccine side, because clearly a huge amount, I mentioned the HR issues, a huge amount of scientists have been dragged off any other vaccine projects and are working feverishly away in this, and that's what has to happen. So some of that R&D on the vaccine side, I think, ironically, is where we're going to see problems. And even the Bill Gates Foundation, who I think is being shown tremendously sort of leadership in this whole issue, he's had to admit that his whole organization is going to have to slow down hugely its other sort of projects and focus everything on trying to sort of solve this sort of problem. So yes, on the vaccine side, I do see some problems. The rest of it, thankfully, not so much.
Okay, there's a question here from Damien Fadden.
Oh, Damien.
Interested to know the impact of the ongoing mutation of the virus and how that might affect the viability of different treatments. I suppose related to that, my understanding is there are a few strains of this virus, and I suppose the more virulent the virus is, the less likely it is to be contagious because it just burns out quicker. So it would be good to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I know it's a big question and has to be answered. There are, I'm not a virologist. I'm an actuary who does invest in sort of biotech, so need to have a bit of caution about what I might say. But I think there's grounds for optimism here. I appreciate the virus is mutating, but all viruses do that. Now, there's a subtle, I did read up about this because it is a very important point. It's not, again, received proper medical attention, but the COVID-19 virus is not a particularly efficient virus. It's actually quite large, and it is vulnerable, ironically, to too much sort of change. So if it mutates too much, it actually just sort of falls apart, essentially. To stop that happening because of its size, it has a special element in it that when it's copying itself, it checks its actual work. And if it finds an error or a mutation, it can go back and sort of correct for that. Now, that feature is actually a pain in the neck, because without that feature, some of the antivirals that work on HIV and hepatitis C could probably be sort of used here. Because those viruses don't have that checking mechanism sort of built into its machinery. So this virus has that machinery built in. Ironically, we can't use antivirals, but the upside of that is it's much more precise at copying itself than HIV and hepatitis C, for instance, to take two viruses that mutate too much for vaccines to be sort of made. Therefore, while it is mutating, the rate of mutation is nothing like HIV or sort of hepatitis C. Also, the nature of coronaviruses is such that in particular, this famous spike or kind of corona is intrinsic to how the virus works. It can't mutate that too much, or else the virus itself isn't actually that viable. So that's why everyone is homing in on making the actual subunits I spoke about earlier often, frankly, just the fragments of these coronas that are sort of sticking out of the actual sort of virus, on the basis that they will have to remain fairly sort of stable. So the theoretical background is actually quite promising on COVID-19. That's not to say that there isn't some genetic drift, and it has to be watched. As long, frankly, as the vaccine lasts at least about 3 to 4 years, I think we're actually fine. Then, okay, fair enough, we may have to sort of revaccinate everybody again. As long as it doesn't mutate enough such that we're in a 2 to 3 year cycle to vaccinate the whole world, and we find after 2 years and sort of 3 months that we have to go back and start doing the first batch again because their vaccine is starting to sort of wear out. That scenario, yes, would be disastrous, but the theoretical information so far would give us some grounds for optimism that that won't be the case.
Okay. Fiona Daly has a question here. Given the WHO have said that there's no evidence that recovery confers immunity, what are the implications of this for vaccine effectiveness?
Yeah, I saw those comments. Yeah, I was disappointed by those comments. I even had a debate with somebody yesterday about this sort of very point. I mean, I will go back to a general observation. COVID-19 is not a particularly special virus. Yes, it's had a special impact on us, but it is not a particularly special virus. If you want to look at a special virus, HIV and hepatitis C and RSV, I mentioned before, if it was acting like those viruses, we would be in sort of far more trouble. I think the WHO comments were strangely harsh. it's almost setting up, clearly we're only at the start. Clearly you can't demonstrate that point of where, sort of where we are today. But any common reading of any other similar virus is that there is some infection, there is some protection there. It's fair to say how long the antibodies might last. In particular, there is some doubts that children, you know, the protection they have mightn't last that long. That's a fair observation. But there's no evidence. I think they've gotten away with kind of framing the question in a certain way. I could turn it around and say there's also no evidence that the immunity is going to wear out sort of quickly either. So I think that's an open question. I don't know quite why they came out with such a harsh statement. I don't think there's a strong science base behind what they've actually sort of said. Perhaps it's in reaction to some comments somewhere where people are being too sort of blasé about it, for instance, and there are some risks there, which I would accept. But unless they can point people like me at some paper to back that up, I don't think those comments were particularly sort of helpful.
Okay, we're probably getting close on time. It's just hit 2 o'clock. I might close on a lighter question. The question here from TJ Burke. You didn't touch on drinking Dettol. Are there any positive trial results from this?
No, I wouldn't recommend it. If I was in that trial, I would prefer to be in the placebo arm myself, to be sort of perfectly honest. And if you're going to get it, I would try and get the sort of low dose arm. I mean, clearly those comments were very unfortunate and not particularly helpful. All I can say, the person who said that, there are some very clever people beside him, particularly sort of Dr. Fauci, and I think we should very much listen to what Dr. Fauci has to say. I know the person who said that has a habit of getting rid of people around him, but he hasn't managed to get rid of Dr. Fauci yet. So as long as he stays there, I think we're actually okay. But yes, I would stay off. I would stay off the actual sort of Dettol.
Yeah, I think it was injecting Dettol anyway.
Yes.
I suppose just to close it out, I probably have one final question. You know, there's a lot of information out there. Some of it's real, some of it's deemed fake. You know, in terms of who people should be listening to or what should they be listening to, any tips or advice on that?
I mentioned Dr. Fauci. I've listened to him. Also in the UK, there's Dr. Vallance, who's the UK's chief scientific officer. What hasn't been publicized so much was he was the former head of R&D in sort of Glaxo. He's the father of the Shingrix vaccine. He knows what he's talking about when it sort of comes to vaccines. He is the father of that sort of vaccine. Also in the UK, Dr. 𝗬𝗍𝗍, who actually spent a lot of his time, was born in Nigeria and spent several years involved in dealing with the various Ebola pandemics. I think he has a very good handle on what's going on. I would listen to those types of sort of people. And after that, I think you just have to be sort of cautious. I do think if you apply your own sort of common sense to a lot of these comments, that's a very helpful attitude to actually have sort of too.
Okay. I think probably 2 o'clock now. We've given you enough of a grilling at this stage, Ivor. So
yeah, I'm off down to the sort of pub for a sort of pint now.
Well, virtual pub, I hope.
A virtual pub.
Okay, so I think we might close it there.
Okay.
I suppose. Thank you, Ivor, for a great presentation. It was very detailed, very informative. Certainly the comments that we're seeing here are very praiseworthy. I'd also like to thank all the attendees today. At one point, we tipped over 200 people. So I think that is probably a first for a webinar event from the Society. But it just demonstrates, I suppose, the interest in the topic and how important it is to everyone. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.